The Paris Commune is one of the most influential revolutions of the modern era that is really almost never spoken about, being one of the first truly socialist revolutions to at least partially succeed in their short-term goals. In the span of only 2 months, the working class of Paris managed to wrestle control of the city from the conservative government, rally the people towards their cause, proclaim a self-sustaining commune, and establish progressive policies that would shape how socialist thought would be formed for the next century. But why the incredibly short window of only 2 months? Despite its early success, the commune would collapse under the pressure of multiple international governments, and its leaders massacred in a brutal show of force from the conservative establishment that controlled most of Europe. To fully understand the events that transpired in early 1871, one must understand the political situation of France during the late 19th century. During this period of time, France was ruled by Napoleon III, yes, nephew of the Napoleon, a couple decades prior, who led an authoritarian government under the Second French Empire. Even though he held dominion over his own empire, Napoleon III never truly lived up to his family namesake, and most of the international community constantly saw him in the shadow of his uncle. Despite his attempts to centralize his political power, reforms are eventually forced out of his hand and granted to the increasingly agitated population of metropolitan France. Most importantly, in 1864, general strikes became legal throughout the country, and public meetings became legal only 4 years later in 1868. This opened doors that were previously closed to the French people, allowing them to participate in public discourse about their own politics. Many meetings occurred on the outskirts of Parisian society, as a new wave of political mobilization washed over the city, truly not seen in this scale since the French Revolution. In 1870, just 1 year before the Paris Commune would be formed, the Second French Empire was thrust into a war where they faced the militarily dominant Kingdom of Prussia. For decades before this, the political situation in Europe was constructed in order to maintain a political status quo that was formed after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Basically, during the peace deals following 1815, an idea of a balance of power was agreed upon by the powers of Europe in order to prevent another continental-wide war from breaking out in the future. Despite this, tensions between France and Prussia were exploited by one Otto von Bismarck, the current Chancellor of Prussia during this time, who goaded the French Emperor into declaring war on Prussia. Technically, the war began due to a disagreement on who would take over the Spanish throne, and then escalated from there. But in reality, Otto von Bismarck had been attempting to unify the disunited German states, and knew to do so he would need a foreign aggressor to rally the German princes to Prussia's side. In this way, Napoleon III fell right into Prussia's hand. Being the aggressor in the war meant that the French had no international support and were forced to face the Prussian army on equal terms, a task the French were not prepared to do. The war itself lasted for a little over 6 months and saw the French defeated on almost every front. Within only 2 months, the Prussians had completely demolished the French army and had reached Paris, where they promptly laid siege to the city. The siege itself lasted for 4 months and was brutal. It only fanned the flames of political dissidence within the city and the desire for change within the government. The siege was increasingly brutal as time went on, with food shortages being the norm and the conservative government of France seeking to prolong the conflict as much as they could. Napoleon III himself was captured by the Prussian army during the Battle of Sedan and was promptly exiled to Britain. The provisional government that formed after the emperor's exile re-established the French Republic under conservative leadership, but still sought to continue the war for a brief moment before being forced to capitulate to the increasingly overwhelming force of the now unified German Empire. Well, with the war now over, those who defended the city of Paris during its siege, known as the National Guard, began to demand further representation within the government if they were to continue to fight and die for it. This sentiment was not accepted by the government, who quickly moved in to disarm the radical National Guard. When they refused to surrender their arms, fighting ensued within the streets of Paris. The National Guard had gained the support of the people due to their defense of the city during the war, and many working-class citizens agreed with their plight, joining their side. The National Guard quickly became bolstered by the people of Paris and managed to push the military out of the city, causing them to retreat south to Versailles. With the city now theirs, the people of Paris began forming a new government that would truly embody the ideals, égalité, fraternité, and liberté. The Commune was officially established in March of 1871 and saw free elections take place within the city of Paris. Although French women were extremely politically active during the formation of the Commune, they were not allowed to participate in said election. Despite this, a multitude of women's clubs formed during the Commune's lifespan, who sought to create a more equal political climate for all citizens of Paris. In only a few short months, these clubs were responsible for creating nurseries for working women, creating and promoting secular education, and in contracting female uniforms for the National Guard. Pivoting off their early military success, the communists in Paris sought to establish a government. After including the mostly free elections, a cabinet was formed, consisting of a multitude of different political parties and ideals. Jacobins, anarchists, socialists, communists, and even moderate Republicans all made up the government of the Commune. Although this does go to show the political inclusivity of this newly formed government, it also shows how politically disorganized the Commune truly was, something that would really go to bite them in the butt later on. Unlike later socialist revolutions of the 20th century, there was no one political figurehead or leader in charge of the Commune's revolution. This meant that there was no unified goal or ideal that the government could work towards. This led to disagreements within the revolutionary government of what the next steps of the Commune should be. Some believed that their goal should be to consolidate their power within the city. Some other representatives in the government even sought to extend their revolution outside the borders of France and export it to Europe as a whole. Furthermore, as the Commune became increasingly more and more radical for the time, many of the moderate Republicans within the government soon became disillusioned with the Commune and its ideals. This disjointed governance would prove instrumental in setting the downfall for the Commune. As the Communards squabbled over what to do next, the French military prepared plans to retake the city of Paris from their temporary capital in Versailles. Even though the Commune saw massive support within the city of Paris, no one truly knew what their endgame was. Feeling surrounded and left with no other option, the Communards eventually attempted to defeat the French military at Versailles by attacking them. This really was the downfall for the Commune, as they lacked any advantage militarily over the Republican government, and their strategy mainly consisted of hoping that the common soldier would join their cause during the fighting. This would not happen, however, as the majority of the French army itself was conscripted from the much more conservative rural parts of the country. The Communard forces were forced to retreat back to Paris, and a couple weeks later were followed by the French National Army. These following weeks are known as Bloody Week in France, as the French army systematically eradicated all those with sympathies to the Commune or any who resisted their regime. Most Communard leaders fled the country, and the Republican government began the slow process of reintegrating the city. Thus, the Paris Commune fell almost as quickly as it rose, mainly due to its political disorganization and lack of a unified idea or leader. Perhaps given a more widespread revolt and a greater collapse of the French military, the Communards could have capitalized on their success further, and one of the first truly socialist governments could have lasted longer than only 2 months.